Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as you and I both know, we're in the process of talking about spending bills, long overdue. We're in our fiscal year as of October the 1st. Well, here comes the end of October, and we're still laboring over how we're going to spend money for the next fiscal year from October 1st until September 30th of the year 2024. And there's debate back and forth between the House and Senate, debate on the Senate floor, and some issues are becoming priorities, and I'd like to address one of them that doesn't get a lot of attention and should. Madam President, I don't agree with former President George Bush on many things, but I've given him credit repeatedly for making the United States a leader in stemming the HIV/AIDS epidemic in some of the poorest parts of the world. 20 years ago, the program was called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. What Bono once said was, quote, the most eloquent expression of American values anyone can think of in recent times. You see, PEPFAR and its companion effort, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, dramatically curtailed the AIDS epidemic that was ravaging the world. It has saved more than 25 million lives so far. Both of these programs provided retroviral drugs for those with AIDS, allowing them to live productive lives and prevent the spread of disease through childbirth. They have been so effective that some might have forgotten just how devastating AIDS was in certain parts of the world. At one point, it was killing more than 2 million people a year globally and leaving 14 million orphans in sub-Saharan Africa. In some of the most highly affected countries, life expectancy had dropped to 20 years. PEPFAR and the Global Fund dramatically improved outcomes for millions of people across the world. These programs are not only the right thing to do, they're also one of the most effective examples of America's soft power and international development effort, and a stark contrast to what China and others are displaying in many parts of the world. So imagine my concern and surprise that there is currently an effort by extreme Republicans in the House of Representatives to block the reauthorization of this hugely successful, bipartisan George W. Bush program over a false and manufactured abortion concern. Taking the extreme position of blocking this life-saving program is as short-sighted and nihilistic as siding with Vladimir Putin and failing to help Ukraine. Madam President, just last week, the Bush Institute and a group of more than 30 retired ambassadors and foreign policy leaders urged Congress to swiftly reauthorize PEPFAR. They wrote, and I quote them, "Abandoning it abruptly now would send a bleak message suggesting we are no longer able to set aside our politics for the betterment of democratization in the world." With this, I agree completely. Right now, America's reputation on the global stage is being threatened by House Republicans' internal politics. But reauthorizing PEPFAR is common sense to reassure the world that America can push past partisanship and use our influence, resources, and power to save lives. Some things are simply beyond politics. Former President Bush acknowledged this when he wrote in the Washington Post recently, "We are on the verge of ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic. To abandon our commitment now would forfeit 2 decades of unimaginable progress and rather further questions about the worth of America's words." I would agree more, couldn't agree more, and I call on my Republican friends to help reauthorize this historic bipartisan life-saving effort without further delay. You see, bipartisan efforts are necessary to get meaningful things done in Washington. We accept that in the Senate. And right now, the most pressing item requiring a bipartisan effort is passing appropriation bills that finally fund the government for the next fiscal year. Government shutdowns should not be commonplace in Washington, and yet, under the other party's leadership, they have been. Almost exactly a month ago, Congress narrowly avoided a government shutdown by passing a stopgap bill that funded the government at current levels for 45 days until the middle of November. 45 days could have been enough for 2 parties in the 2 chambers to negotiate a plan, a compromise. But a few extreme Republicans got in the way. Without a speaker of the House of Representatives for more than 3 weeks, the House was unable to take action. The House was rendered useless in helping to create a plan to fund the government. And now, with only 18 days until the government's lights are turned off, time is running out. While the House was paralyzed and unable to govern, here in the Senate, we were diligently working across party lines to negotiate a funding package. For the past week, the Senate has been considered amendments on a package of 3 funding bills, known as the minibus. The minibus provides funding for military construction, as well as for the Departments of Veterans Affairs, Agriculture, Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development. And I worked with the presiding officer to ensure that the package includes important funding for the people, families, and communities of our state of Illinois. For example, it includes more than $5 million for agriculture-related spending in our state, funding that will continue cutting-edge agricultural research in our state and send rural development dollars to small towns to make health care and emergency services more comprehensive in underserved areas. The package also earmarks more than $16 million for military construction projects in Illinois, funding that will facilitate training and readiness for our men and women in uniform. It includes more than $35 million in earmarks for community development and infrastructure projects to improve roads, transit, airports, and community centers. This minibus will strengthen communities in Illinois, and it's being worked on a bipartisan basis. I'm glad to support its passage and urge my colleagues to do the same. Madam President, I yield the floor.